Hoshana Rabba is a little bit of an overlooked Yom Tov, and it's associated with a part of the four species of sukkahs that's also a little bit overlooked, the Arava. But believe it or not, the Arava actually has an incredible secret, not just to sukkahs, but to what it means to really connect. Hoshana Rabba nivdul mishayimei sukkahs b'chamei inyonim. Hoshana Rabba is different to the rest of sukkahs in many respects, some of which are as follows. We're going to focus on two things. Aleph. Back in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, or every day of Sukkot, they would circle the Mizbech once. Whereas on Hoshana Rabba, they went around 7 times, and we do a similar thing in our Hoshana in Shul. Number 2, base. During the rest of the week, after they went around the Mizbeach, during the rest of Sukkot, they would put Aravos sticks on the side of the Mizbeach, only if it wasn't Shabbos. But if Shabbos happened during Sukkot, you did not put the Arava on the side of the Mizbeach, unless it is Hoshana Rabba, the 7th day, then then you specifically put the twig of the Arava on the side of the Mizbeach in order to publicize that this is a special mitzvah, the whole concept of Arava. Those are differences that were relevant in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. But nowadays, we actually don't do any activity with an Arava without the lulav as a symbol of the Beis Hamikdash, except on the last day, on Hoshana Rabba. That's when we take the Arava and we do a procedure with the Arava. In other words, we may Arava in a kaim klal, which means the whole concept of the independent concept of an Arava does not apply on the rest of Sukkot nowadays without a Beis Hamikdash. Something else. Now, the fascinating thing about what distinguishes Hoshana Rabba now, since the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and that is the timing. We engineer the calendar to accommodate Hoshana Rabba. It's fascinating because when they set up the calendar, they made sure that Hoshana Rabba can never be on Shabbos. So in the days when they used to wait for witnesses to testify that they had seen the new moon, if they saw that Hoshana Rabba was going to be on a Shabbos, they would add a day to one of the months in order to ensure that Hoshana Rabba should not be on a Shabbos. And the reason for that is because we didn't want Hoshana Rabba to be on a Shabbos, because then we would cancel the Arava, and we don't want to cancel the Arava. As the Yerushalmi spells it out, Rabbi Simon used to instruct those people who work out, this is now the Cheshbon, where they were making a calendar in advance, and it'd say, so try and work out the calendar in such a way that the shofar is not on a Shabbos and the Arava is not on a Shabbos. And if you're under pressure, rather have a Shabbos on Rosh Hashanah than have a Shabbos on Hoshana Rabba. Fascinating. And even in subsequent generations, when they were no longer citing the moon, our calendar system, and the whole system of the months is set up on a calculation that's determined in advance. The same thing. The calendar is designed in such a way that Hoshana Rabba can never fall on a Shabbos. In fact, there's certain opinions, many opinions of the Rishonim tell us that that's part of the reason why we design the calendar, that Rosh Hashanah can never fall on a Sunday or Wednesday or Friday. Because if Rosh Hashanah is going to be on a Sunday, then Hoshana Rabba is going to be Shabbos. What's fascinating about this is we're not worried about the first day of Rosh Hashanah being on a Shabbos and therefore no shofar, which is doraisa, and we're not worried about the first day of Sukkot falling on a Shabbos and therefore no lulav, which is doraisa. But Arava, suddenly we're so concerned. Tosfos asks this question, gives a very practical suggestion. So Tosfos asks, Rabba, which is only to remember a custom that used to be in the Beis Hamikdash, we're scared that it shouldn't be cancelled by Shabbos. Shofar and lulav, which are doraisa, we're not worried. But Tosfos answers, and it's true. The thing is that people are not going to undermine the shofar and the lulav in future years if they missed it one year because of Shabbos. The Rabbanon, but seeing as our Rabbi is on your rabbinic law, I said if we forget about people are going to be a little bit unsure about whether or not it's something that they should continue. But Hoshana Prisha, the Prisha spells it out even more. Because there is fear that the Jewish people should not forget this mitzvah. Because it's something which people might take lightly. Therefore, the rabbis chose to fortify their mitzvah even more than we fortify the mitzvah of the Torah. Okay, so we've just learned something fascinating. That the Rabba, which is just a minhag, is something that we re-engineer the whole calendar to accommodate. Now, nothing is by chance, and it must be teaching us something. Everything in Torah is absolutely precise. We'll move on. The very fact that we engineer the calendar to accommodate the fact that the Rabba should not be on a Shabbos and Hoshana Rabba should not be on a Shabbos, Moira al-Kach is proof means that there's something about the Arava of Hoshana Rabba which is unique and does not apply to any other mitzvah, and therefore gets us priority that other mitzvahs don't have. And we need to understand what is so special about the Arava. So before we can understand the magic of the Arava, let's understand the context, the parameters of the mitzvah of Arava. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Arava was its own mitzvah. Melvad mitzvah Arava shebelulav, besides the Arava that was part of the 4 species of the lulav. What was the mitzvah? Each day of the 7 days of Sukkot, this is both in the Mishnah, and then subsequently the Rambam says almost identical words. They used to bring these twigs of Arava, and they put them standing upright around the sides of the Mizbech, and their heads bent over the top of the Mizbech. When you brought them and you placed them around the Mizbech, they had to do a series of blasts of the shofar. Now, okay, so we've just identified that the Arava is an independent mitzvah of the Daled Minim. Now, what exactly does that mean? There are 2 possible ways to look at it. Aleph, one way to look at it is there's another action. There's a thing called an Arava, it's a mitzvah, and there are 2 actions associated with it. One is it has to be part of the Daled Minim. One is you have to put it around the Mizbech. So in other words, it's another action done with the same plant, the Arava. Meaning, this Arava that we're putting on the side of the Mizbech technically fits into the same category as the Arava that's going inside the Lulav. But we're using it for a separate mitzvah, a new mitzvah that the Arava performs. Or we could say Beis. Not only is the mitzvah performed by the individual, a different mitzvah. When you're putting the Arava on the Mizbech, it's a different mitzvah to putting the Arava in the Lulav. But perhaps the Arava itself has the quality of being a different Arava to the one that's in the Lulav. And there are practical applications in halacha. If I go with the first view, which is it's the same Arava now being used for a different purpose, then then the halachic status of what constitutes a kosher Arava for the ones that have to go around the Mizbeach must be the same halachic status for kosher Arava for the Lulav, which means it means it's the same concept, it's the same kind of Arava, it has to be identical in both mitzvahs. And therefore, if there's a certain amount of leaves that you have to have on the Arava in the Lulav, you have to have the same amount of leaves on the Arava on the Mizbeach. Whereas if you take the second view, that there are 2 different classes of Arava, one that belongs in a Lulav, one that goes around the Mizbeach, then then there might actually be a different halachic status for what is considered a kosher Arava for the Mizbeach. We can actually use this to understand the debate in the Gemara between Abba Shol and the Chachamim about what is the status or what is the halachic requirement for the Arava on the Beis Hamikdash. Does it have to have 3 moist, fresh leaves like the Arava in the Lulav? Or is it enough to have 1 leaf? Now, it's in each segment, right? But the fact is it 1 or 3 leaves in a segment in order for it to be considered kosher? Not only that, we say, Postak Rambam, the Rambam Paskins, Aloch Moshe Sinai, that we have a tradition all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu, Shemevin B'Mikdash HaRava Cheres Chutz Ma'Arava Shebelulav, that you bring in the Beis Hamikdash a different Acheres, a different Arava to the Arava that you bring in the Lulav. And you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of this Arava by plucking out the Arava from your Lulav. And it's kosher even if it's just got one little leaf per node. When you pay attention to the Rambam's language, first he calls it a different Arava. And then he tells us you cannot use the Arava from the Lulav. That's very clear that the Rambam's view is that you're not now doing a second action with the same class of Arava. But it's a new class of Arava. Therefore, because it's a different class of Arava, you can't use your Lulav Arava for this purpose because it's a different class of Arava. Which basically is saying is even if you brought that Arava from the Lulav without the Lulav, it's still not going to be considered kosher because it's got to be a different Arava. And Beis, and the Shir, the halachic measurement or determination of what's a kosher Arava is different because it's a different Arava. So that's pretty clear that the Rambam is of the view that the Arava that belongs to Hoshana Rabba is a different class of Arava to the Arava that belongs in a Lulav. So therefore the Rambam would therefore understand this must be what lies at the root of the debate between Abba Shaul and the Chachamim. Abba Shaul gomar Arava shebemikdash me'arvei nochal ksiv shtayim achas l'lulav achas l'mikdash. So Abba Shaul learns, how do we know that you're supposed to have this whole ceremony of the Arava on Hoshana Rabbah? Because when the Torah spoke about Aravos, it's called them in the plural. Arvei nochal. One is for the Lulav, and one is for Hoshana Rabbah, implying two different Aravos. Whereas the Rabbanan say, Aloch Moshe Sinai. There's no source in Torah specifically, overtly, for the Arava. It's Aloch Moshe Sinai, Kamayas and Atius, and Nisach like various other things which are only considered Aloch Moshe Sinai, and of course the one that's relevant to us is Nisach the water that was poured on the Mizbeach at the time of Sukkot. So how would the Rambam read this? Ali b'Abba Shaul, according to Abba Shaul, Kiven shemekayat tzivya shel al mitzvah rabu makos v'avri nochal hamafayrish ba'arava shebelulav. Seeing as the pasuk is in the context of a lulav, harei hachetza shel arava shebemikdash ois hachetza shel arava shebelulav. Well, it's arvei plural version of arav voice. Which arav is? The arava of the lulav has a plural role. It could be used in a lulav. It could be used for Hoshana Rabbah. Same chetza, same entity. So the whole purpose of the mitzvah, the whole purpose of the pasuk is to tell us that there's another role that this arvei nachal that belongs to the lulav also plays. Of the Rabbanan, whereas the Rabbanan with this filu, they say no. The arava that you use in the Beis Hamikdash, that is halach l'moshe Sinai. It's not from the pasuk. And this Arava has absolutely no association with Arvei Nachal, which is the pasuk. Therefore, so therefore you could, or perhaps you have to say, that's a different mitzvah, and it's a different quality of Arava that's going to have different rules. Okay, so now we understand that there's a possibility, two different ways that we look at this Arava. We still have to ask ourselves the question, so what does it teach us? So taking the view of the Rabbanan, which is obviously the majority opinion, and therefore the way the Rambam paskins, the Arava of the Beis Hamikdash of Hoshana Rabbah is different to the Arava that belongs in a lulav. From that perspective, so we need to understand what is the deeper meaning of this Arava. There's a beautiful explanation about what an Arava is from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Arava heimanoshim pshutim dekima mitzvahs hu rak ve'emuna pshuta. Frierdiker Rebbe says that Aravos represent the simple Yidden who serve the Eibusha, do mitzvahs just with simple, unsophisticated emunah. With that information, we can revolutionize the very, very popular medrash about what the four species represent. That the four species represent four types of Jews. The esrog has both a fragrance and a taste. That's references the Jew who is steeped in Torah and full of good deeds. The lulav comes from a date palm that has a good taste, but there's no fragrance. So that represents that's the Jew who excels in Torah but doesn't really have many maisim tovim. And then hadash yesh b'reach ve'en b'tam, the hadassim that have a fragrance but no taste is yisrael sheyesh b'hem maisim tovim ve'en b'hem Torah. Though the Jews excel in good deeds but don't have much Torah. So the arava that's void of both, that has no fragrance and no taste, that's the yid who doesn't really have anything. Now, mishitchis l'shen hamedrash mashma, the superficial, and there we say common interpretation of this medrash is that only the esrog represents the Jew who's got both Torah u'maisim tovim. Mashenken shar asugim chaser b'hem prat echad Torah ikim hamitzvos, oy chaser b'hem shnei ho'inyonim. Whereas all of the others are either lacking one or possibly both of these qualities. That is the common interpretation of the Medrash. The Frierdiker Rebbe's perspective radically changes that. Let's look back what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. The Kol Yisraelim Shovim Binyan Akim Torah Mitzvahs, every yid equally fulfills Torah Mitzvahs. In other words, every one of the four types of Jews described by the four minim, they are engaged in Torah mitzvahs. They learn and they know Torah and they fulfill mitzvahs. And it's not just a chiddush that the Frierdiker Rebbe made up. It has to be this way. It makes sense this way. Because the class of person who is the master of Torah, in other words, they learn Torah properly, obviously must be keeping mitzvahs. Because if you're learning Torah properly, Torah precipitates action. And if a person is truly fulfilling mitzvahs, he must have Torah knowledge. Otherwise, how else will he know how to fulfill the mitzvahs? Which implies that even the arava who gets such a bad rap in this medrash, that is actually referring to a yid who learns Torah and keeps mitzvahs. Why is he called an arava? We'll see. But because when you look deeper at what the medrash is saying, it's telling us we're not looking over here at the pragmatism and the practicality. Are you doing it or are you not doing it? No, we're looking at the depth, at the quality at which you're doing it. The person who's an expert in Torah, the lulav, that implies developed intellect. The person who is an expert in maisim tovim, the hadas, that implies an expert, a master of midas. And that's really the difference between the four groups of Jews. The esrog is not just the person who does Torah mitzvahs. That's the person who does Torah mitzvahs, and you can see the greatness of seichel and the greatness of midas in their avodas Torah mitzvahs. The lulav, on the other hand, is the person who's completely dedicated to Torah, but what you see as their guiding light and as their great asset is their wisdom, their understanding, their intellect. And in the hadas, what do you see? Primarily good character. Whereas the arava refers to simple people. They're doing what they have to do. Without illustrating any greatness of intellect or any greatness of character. What drives them is simple, unsophisticated faith. Which implies that implies that there is some advantage that the arava has even over the other three, including the esrog. What could be potentially the greatness of the arava? Simplicity, as the Baal Shem Tov says, that the simplicity of simple people is one with the simplicity of Hashem's essence. So now that we have this idea that the arava contains some greatness that even the esrog doesn't have, the greatness of simplicity that links directly into the simplicity of atzmos, you're going to see that in the arava, the physical arava itself. So the simplicity that is implied and that is implicit in the Jew represented by the Arava, Mishtakif Gam Arava Kipshut, is something you can see in the physical Arava itself. One of the reasons why these are the four species that we specifically use in order to be able to fulfill this mitzvah is because each of the four represent the concept of unity. In order for a lulav to be kosher, the leaves have to all be pressed together, a symbol of unity. In order for hadas to be kosher, it has to have 3 leaves coming out of every node, a symbol of unity. The Gemara calls Aravas, in fact the Gemara asks the question, what is Achvana? And it says it's Aravas, because they grow in clusters, in clumps. The esrog is a little different. The esrog survives all 4 seasons. And what the esrog does is it brings together unity through the seasons of the year. Not only does it survive all the seasons, but it grows thanks to all the seasons. So it unites all the seasons in its growth. So now this concept of unity, which you find in various things in the world, which seems to be counterintuitive, because the nature of the world is that things should be separated. They should always be looking for their own identity and moving away from each other. So the idea of having achdus, because you're living in a world, and the world is a place of concealment, which therefore conceals the underlying unity between things and highlights the differences between things. So the only thing that allows the possibility of achdus is you have to have some tinge, some sense of absolute achdus, which is the unsophisticated achdus of Hashem. Right? One. Not a whole bunch of things coming together to be one. Fundamentally one. So that very deep, profound oneness of Hashem is expressed in all of the 4 species of the lulav. To the extent that these 4 species do not portray the selfness, the individuality that is so normal in our world, but a certain degree of bittul that they have, which leads to achdus. And if you think about it, all unity requires some level of bittul, some level of surrender of self. So all 4 of these things, all 4 of these species represent achdus, but not all in the same way. For 3 of them, the esrog, the lulav, hadas, where do you see the achdus? In the specific item that you're looking at. So ba'olav shalulav zeh, I'm looking at one lulav, and that expresses achdus, the way its leaves are together. Or yishalbad hadas zeh kishel atzmam. Or I look at one twig of a hadas, and I can see the unity in its leaves. Olav kifusin plus bechad kina, the 2 ways that it expresses unity. Even the esrog, which survives all the 4 seasons, you don't see that it's the link between one lulav and another, or one hadas and another, or one esrog and another. You can just see the unity within their own personal experience. But you know what happens to the arava? The way aravas grow is in unison with other aravas. So it's not just that the individual branch of the arava expresses unity, it is fundamentally unified. Because the arava's achdus is broader and more encompassing than the specific achdus within each of the other species. And as we said, that is counterintuitive. It's against the nature of the world where things are starkly different from each other. Move on. The only reason this could be, must be, because in the arava you can see, you can experience that simplicity of oneness, of true achdus, more than in the others. And that's why the arava is the only one that has a name that implies oneness. Which is called, it's called achvana, it's called the brotherhood of Aravos, which you don't find with the others, because there's a fundamental unity in Aravos that does not exist in the other species. Let's take it deeper. The real reason, the reason why the Arava expresses the deepest type of oneness is actually because of what it lacks. Other three species. In a cave, because every one of them has something which you could identify as an asset or multiple assets. Yesh beitam, lulav. The lulav, oh, look what it's got to offer. It's got flavor. Yesh boireach, hadas. Oh, look what it's got to offer. The hadas has fragrance. Oh, yesh beishneim, esrog. Or maybe it has both, like the esrog, which is so amazing. The moment you have specifics that you could identify and say, this is what makes something great, that hides the fact that there's a non-specific, unsophisticated core unity. That's also going to therefore obscure the degree of their unity. Because what creates unity, as we've said, simplicity. So the less simplicity I can see, the less obvious the unity, also the more shallow the unity is. In fact, you could look at the esrog and say, the reason esrog is special is not because it represents unity, it's because it smells beautiful. The reason that lulav is part of is so important to the Dalet Minim, it's not necessarily because of Achdus, it's because it represents Torah learning. Whereas the Arava has nothing obvious to sell. So what's its big selling point? Unity. To the extent that were it not for its symbolism of unity, it would not belong in the four species. Because you know what's so powerful about the Arava? The depth of the essence of oneness is expressed in the Arava, both in the fact that overrides identifiable greatness, and look, it's even called Achvana. You find a similar thing with the Jewish people. Even though, of course, every single Jewish person has a neshama, which is a piece of Hashem. And obviously that neshama is directly plugged into Hashem's unsophisticated essence. You look at certain people and say they are wealthy in terms of their depth of understanding and the development of their character. In a Midas people who are great Baalei Seichel, people who have very developed character, you don't necessarily see that their basis of the Yiddishkeit is simple faith. In a Midas the simplicity and sincerity of the essence of the neshama is clouded by the sophistication of the persona that they've created. Whereas specifically simple Jews, where you don't see glaring at you their incredible intellect or their incredible personality. By them you see the emunah clearly. Because as the Baal Shem Tov said, the simplicity of their persona becomes one with the simplicity of Hashem's essence. So the Arava is now the hero. Which helps us understand why there's such a great focus on the mitzvah of the Arava, on Hoshana Rabba, even over the Arava, which is part of the Lulav. You look at the Arava that belongs in the Lulav, it doesn't seem to have anything to offer. And therefore, as we've noted a number of times now, the Arava represents unity in a profound way more than the others. But because that Arava has now been included in a group, and in that group are the stellar personalities, the Esroig, the Lulav, the Hadas, and they all become a single mitzvah. Then the simplicity of the Arava, which is supposed to be represented by lack of visible traits, is now not so clear. Because it's almost like the Arava has been upgraded, because it's hanging out now with these very qualified special entities. So it's also been kind of upgraded from its simple state. Whereas the Arava that was used in the Beis Hamikdash, the entire ritual, the entire mitzvah is just the Arava on its own. No link to any of the other fancy elements. In fact, the Rambam even says you can't use the Arava from your lulav. Therefore, there is no obstruction, there's no obscuring, there's nothing about the fanciness of the other entities that block the simplicity of what an Arava is. That's why there's an opinion that says when you go around the Mizbeach, you don't hold this Arava with you. That Arava is going to go later. And that's why the halacha is that the Rabba has to be taken independently. And as we saw earlier from the Rambam, you cannot borrow your Arava from the lulav and use it for this mitzvah. And that's why the halachic parameters of what makes a kosher Arava is different to the ones for the Arava in the lulav. It's much simpler. It doesn't need 3 leaves. A single leaf in a section is good enough. All of that illustrates that this is not a unity born out of bringing things together. This is a unity that is absolute. And that explains why the whole concept of the Rabba that was used on Hoshana Rabba, it has to be passed down by an unwritten tradition and cannot even be not written in the Torah. It's not even alluded to in the Torah. And this is similar to what the Alter Rebbe explains in the Good Torah. The difference between the drawing of water during the 7 days of Sukkot, which is passed down also in a special tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, compared to pouring wine on the Mizbeach, which is stated explicitly multiple times in the Torah. What does Alter Rebbe say? The reason for that is because the source of the concept of pouring water on the Mizbeach comes from a much higher, deeper source than the source of pouring wine on the Mizbeach. It's too profound, it's too high, it's too abstract to actually come into the written word. But something that you could form as letters on parchment. As the Alter Rebbe goes into great detail in the Good Torah. So likewise, is the greatness of the Arava of Hoshana Rabba in the Beis Hamikdash over the Arava that belongs in the Lulav. It's also not explicitly instructed in Tanakh. Why is that? Because it comes from such a high level that is beyond being able to be described or captured in words. In human terms, this is a very elevated part of the neshama, which is one with Eibush, the simplest part of the soul. Therefore, a Jew doesn't have to be instructed about this clearly, in a written instruction and a doctrine, because it's beyond that. Well, if we are now moving, which brings us back to the Aravas nowadays, when we're not circling a Mizbeach, and we only do something with an Arava on a Hoshana Rabba, where we take it and beat it. What we're doing is not even halacha l'Moshe Misinai, because it's not in the Beis Hamikdash, it's not around the Mizbeach, so it's not really the halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So why are we doing it? Ela minig neviim bavad, as it says in the Siddur. It's a minig that was passed down from the neviim. But frat, if we are pirish b'rishanim sheminig neviim, especially when you consider that Rishonim explain what does it mean minig neviim, lo sheinigas ha'om and a minig shenogu kain v'omrei moisen k'moisen me'elehem. That it's actually a minig the Nevi'im used to do. They didn't tell anybody else to do it, but people saw them doing it and they started to copy it. And as a good for raya, that is proof. Shebipnimius, Arinali says, Gam mitzvah Arava shebemikdash. That indicates that our Aravas nowadays on Hoshana Rabba are even deeper and higher than the Arava that was in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. She halacha l'Moshe Misinai, because that was halacha l'Moshe Misinai. We're doing a minig. How can a minig be greater than that? Let's go back again to the Good Torah. So there, where the Alter Rebbe is talking about the difference between pouring wine on the Mizbeach, which is halacha in the Torah specifically, and pouring water on the Mizbech, which is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And then he brings hakafas, which is supposed to do on Shmini Atzeres and outside of Israel, Simchas Torah as well. Not only are hakafas not written in Torah Shebechsav, they're not even written in Torah Shebal. You won't find it in the Gemara, nothing. It's just a custom. Says the Alter Rebbe, that the hakafas, the dancing of hakafas, is even higher than pouring water on the Mizbech Simchat Beis HaShoeva, which is considered such a great and powerful and elevated thing. Why is that? Because a minhag zeh shisol nogin came, the fact that Jews have adopted a practice must be because this is something rooted in the source of the Jewish soul. We know that the Jewish soul is higher than Torah. So if this is driven by the depth of the soul, then it's driven by something which is deeper than Torah. Because the simplicity of the Jewish person is one with the simplicity of Hashem's essence. We can intuit those things that are too profound to be written. Meaning we can intuit something which is even higher than Hashem's overt wisdom and will, the written and taught mitzvahs. That's why we behave in a particular way without any guidance from the Torah. The fact that the Jewish people follow such a custom as a Nasa Torah that consolidates that custom and makes it into Torah. Minig Yisrael Nasa Torah. The custom of Jews becomes Torah. Which explains why they're so careful to make sure that Hoshana Rabba, the day of celebrating their Rabba, can never coincide with Shabbos and therefore be cancelled. The fact that nowadays we calculate in such a way that Hoshana Rabba should not be on the Shabbos is so the logic why we do this is because we don't want people to take it lightly. If they see 1 year we're not doing it, maybe they'll think it's no longer a thing. And therefore the Chachamim had to reinforce their words by ensuring that it never falls on a Shabbos. Fine, that's a valid reason, but the deeper reason is it's because the Rabba stems from such an incredibly high level. Because when you have a minhag such as the Rabba, which was never taught and was just, so to speak, motivated from deep within the Jewish person, that illustrates a point of contact with Eibishter's essence. And therefore it is something that has to always happen, because when you touch the essence can never change. So the essence has to be available and has to be in practice every single year. That is very empowering. That impacts the time that we live in, the physical time. That the based in reworks the calendar, and they do all kinds of things to ensure that there should be no impediment to the ritual of the Arava on the time of the Arava, because it's that powerful, it has to be accessed. Very, very profound lesson, obviously, for us. Things are not always as they appear. The depth of something is usually not visible on the outside, and the minhag of a Yid expresses the connection of a Yid to the Eibishter and realize exactly how powerful that is.